Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hey folks, welcome to the podcast. This is episode 63, and I did a pretty long interview with a young instructor, Dan Trailescu. It's a great conversation, lots of topics that I covered with him that he had some really interesting things to say about, and maybe in a way that we haven't covered before. So I think you'll enjoy this episode. There is obviously also a bonus episode in which he answers questions from my patrons, and all the links to that and much more will be at wimsblog.com/63. So as always, a quick shout out to one of my patrons, because it's thanks to their support that this is possible. So shout out to Jonathan Mendoza. Jonathan has been one of my patrons for several years now. I think you're closing in on 3 years now. So thank you, Jonathan, for your support. And same thing to obviously everybody else who likes the stuff I do. So you can go to wimsblog.com/donate. Check it out there, different ways to support. But obviously you can always share and like, subscribe, and so on, because that also helps out a lot. So without further ado, let's dive into the episode. Hey folks, welcome to the episode. We are now live with Dan Trailescu, and Dan and I talked about it. I am doing a more or less accurate rendition of his name, Trailescu. Hi Dan, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you, Wim?
I am excellent. Dan and I just talked a little bit before we started recording. So if we joke around a little bit, this is because we've been joking around for a while. So now quickly, all the links that we might get to will be at wimsblog.com/63. That's episode 63. So 63, the numbers. I don't know how many links we'll have, but you will find them there. All right, Dan, let's get started. I think the easiest way might be just if we talk a little bit about your background. I took that from your website. You started with Aikido, if I'm not mistaken. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I did what a lot of people do, which is started when I got to university. There were a couple of martial arts clubs there. I looked at what they had, decided I was going to do Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu, and I happened to walk into Aikido first. That was about 15 years ago, and I've been doing that ever since.
Okay.
Because it was university, the club had a really high instructor turnover because people would they'd get jobs elsewhere and then somebody else would come. So it was kind of a mix of styles. And I've done other stuff since then, but that's still like my main martial art.
Okay. So you still practice? You also teach?
So I practice. I occasionally teach. I don't have a dojo anymore because as women and I were talking about this before, we move around a fair bit at the moment for my wife's job. So when I was living in Cyprus, I had a dojo there for a couple of years, and I was doing part of the teaching after I moved back to the UK. And now here I only really do some seminars every once in a while, and that's mostly self-defense.
Okay, cool. And then you kind of also evolved towards more reality-based self-defense training. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. So about 6 months after I started Aikido, I started doing some kickboxing as well. And I did that for a couple of years, and some other martial arts, a little bit of judo, some capoeira. I was a little obsessed in college, maybe just a little. I started to notice some things, like when we were sparring, not all the stuff that I would do normally in training would come out. And so I started to look into this a little bit, and I was interested in self-defense, and so I started reading some things by reality-based instructors, Jeff Thompson in the beginning, actually some stuff from Lauren Christensen, Rory Miller, and I thought that maybe there's a little bit more to it. And then talked to some people, and then Rory did a seminar in Scotland. At that time I had moved away for work, and I came back, I was visiting my wife, and I was like, hey honey, then girlfriend, and hey honey, here I am, but I'm just going to stay for like a day, then I'm going down to Edinburgh for the seminar. She also does martial arts, so it was okay.
Cool.
She's married me since then, so but I started training with Rory, and I was like, this is what I want to do. Yeah. And so did that a few more times, and invited him over to teach at our club, and been training with him and Balance Dynamics and a bunch of other people ever since, and started incorporating that into teaching a little bit more as well.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, and speaking of Rory, you did his conflict communication instructor training, and so you're a certified trainer in that regard, right?
Yeah, I was one of the early people who did that because I've been training with him for a while, and I'd gone through Concom a few times, and then we talked about it, and he said that he started certifying people. So I was like, yeah, I would like, that, because I also used to use it at work, and I saw that there was an opportunity there as well, not just for self-defense but also professional skills. It's a really good program. Conflict resolution is something you need in lots of places.
Yeah.
So yeah, did that.
I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, obviously, there's the book. I read it a while ago when it came out. For the people who don't know what conflict communication from Rory is like, could you just give a little bit more of a background on that?
Sure. So conflict communications it's a program. It's a conflict resolution program that's a little different. So rather than just give you a set of strategies or start with a particular assumption, it is sort of if you had an instruction manual for our social brain or our brain on conflict, that's basically what it is. So it takes you through some of the models and some of the ways that we are kind of evolved to react to conflict.
Yeah.
And then what the implications of that are on how we actually act under conflict, and what you can do about that to resolve it constructively. So it's not about not having conflict, it's just about making sure that that's constructive. And it's an experience-based program. So I think it was Rory and Mark McYoung originally who came up with it. And now I think they kind of do slightly different versions. But so there's some scientific models out there. They're mostly older ones, but they're just kind of this is a model that fits what we see in experience. This isn't based on the model.
Yeah. I like that a lot when I read that, because he uses the triune brain model in the book, and I remember reading about that a really long time ago. I forget I don't know the title in English, but it was kind of like Neanderthals and dinosaurs at work, or something along those lines. And they would talk about the primitive brain and so on. You call it the dinosaur brain, the lizard brain, and then the Neanderthal brain and so on. So they have a different model for saying something very similar. And it always struck me because it made, I recognized a lot of the stuff that I experienced personally from those kind of models. And that's why I really like what you just said, is that maybe the model's a little bit outdated, but it really helps you understand what we're talking about, and obviously apply the knowledge more efficiently.
Yeah, you have to always be a little bit careful, because we're used to getting a lot of this stuff from popular science books, where a researcher comes up with a model and then they make it available for the public in a format that's understandable for the public, so it's based on the model. In those cases, it really matters if is that how the underlying mechanics work. For programs that are experience based, what matters is, does the model fit? And in some ways, the triune brain is something that's pretty easy to understand, even if our understanding of neuroscience has evolved beyond that. But it's more useful when you're in a seminar, when you're explaining that. And everyone always says that this is just a model. This is not the mechanics. But it's more useful than saying, well, the recent research on says that there are antagonistic neuronal networks that cause this effect. People go like, huh? What's that? So you have to have you have to present information in a way that is actually useful.
Yeah.
And I think that this model does and similar models do a really good job of that.
Yeah.
You just have to remember the map is not the territory.
Yeah, the value of the model is in many ways in how effective it is at transmitting the information that you want to transmit, or get the student into the right frame of mind, or put them in a position where they can actually understand what's coming next. And I found that in many cases, especially when it comes to things like communications under stress, which is what conflict pretty much always is. You've got all this stuff already going on the inside, and then you have to manage the same thing that the other guy has going on the inside as well. In his brain, if you have no concept of oh, okay, he just had an adrenal dump, he is no longer rational. So the best thing I can say right now to make it blow up is hey, calm down. Because the next second the punch is going to go flying. So having those models, I think, is very, very useful for people who are not necessarily interested in all the really dry scientific research, even though it's obviously valuable and interesting in and of itself, but it doesn't help you out necessarily.
you need something first that you can use, and then you can refine it. Then you can dig into the research. You can do all that stuff. You can make bits of it better for you, because this is, unless you're doing the instructor training, you're going to spend a couple of hours hearing, and then you got to go put it into practice. So there's no point having something that will take, a month of deep study or 6 months of deep study in there. You need something first that you can actually use, and then you can refine this. And one of the things I like about Concom, like you said, is it addresses the stuff that goes on the inside.
Yeah.
It also addresses the things that you might have done to piss the other person off. Like if you don't know, because we talk about the monkey brain, if you don't know what social problem, what monkey problem you just stepped on, and you're still trying to kind of what you think is being rational. You might not be. You might be yourself kind of being. But if you're trying to be rational, but you did just violated like a monkey rule, a social rule, you're not going to get very far. You have to first kind of hand over a banana. Like, okay, we calm the monkeys down first, and then we can talk about this.
Yeah.
And it's quite useful for that. And I find that a lot of other kind of conflict resolution programs first assume that both people are trying to be constructive, and kind of forget that this will all happen under a lot of emotional stress,
Yeah, and I think this is very classical, an issue that crops up a lot when you have, and again, with all due respect to academia, intellectuals from academia handling topics that have to do with violence without actually having any real life experience with violence or living in a violent environment. Because they start from a very different place of understanding, and again, all due respect to these people, because they deserve it, and we need them to keep digging into the science. But I've seen it many times when people translate, for instance, from Japanese or from Chinese manuals or texts about martial arts and self-defense and so on, especially the older ones. And they translate it into English or whatever language, and they might be really good translators, but because they have no experience with violence, the translation either doesn't make sense, or you get a completely wrong impression about it. And my teacher speaks and writes Japanese and Mandarin, does historical research, and he did translations from old Chinese texts. And then when I read his, and when I read those from other people, I'm like, I don't know what that other guy's talking about. I know what Dan's saying, but I don't know what the other guy's talking about, because I'm sure that the translation is correct, but it's not helpful. It doesn't help me understand what the guy meant when he wrote it.
Yeah, I mean, with the same with academia, that matches my experience. And like, because I've read quite a bit of the research on self-defense, such as it is. And violence that's out there, and it's very difficult to make sense of it if you don't have a context of where the authors are coming from. Yeah. There's kind of, for example, there's some research that came out specifically for women's self-defense, and at least for the qualitative research on self-defense, almost all of it is exclusively for like women's self-defense and sexual assault. That's almost all of it. That's mostly because it's difficult to get funding for this kind of stuff, and women's studies are one of the areas where that tends to come from. But so a lot of the early stuff was written by people who are also self-defense instructors, but with a particular organization. So the way that they present things makes that particular style of training sound like literally the term gold standard pops up in later research, because academics don't have a context of the industry, and they take this earlier research that said that. Yeah. And I was trying to find it because like, nobody I know in the self-defense industry says that this type of stuff is the gold standard. And then I went back and was like, the people teaching it were the ones writing the papers. And then you have researchers who don't have any context, and there's one paper, and I think this is the article that I sent you to look at, where they're looking at a review paper and saying we don't understand because all our research says that self-defense instruction should make a difference, but this review says it doesn't. And I'm looking at the review and going, that's not about self-defense instruction, that's about sexual assault education. And that doesn't make the students safer. Why would it? That's for a different thing, And it's like, because they don't have that context, they couldn't understand what they were looking at.
Yeah, it's a common problem, and I guess it's true of many different areas and different types of expertise. But we're talking about martial arts and self-defense, so that's our stuff. And maybe we can get into it a little bit, and I'll put a link in the show notes where you wrote an interesting article on your site called "The Research Breakdown: Behavioral Response to Threat." Tell me if I'm misstating, but it's kind of like you're looking at a bunch of research on the topic of self-defense and just drawing out. Okay, so what does it say? What are kind of like the big trends and the conclusions that you could find? Would that be accurate?
Kind of. Like, this is actually a breakdown of a specific paper, but it's a review paper. So the actual paper looks at a bunch of the research specifically for sexual assault. And specifically, the authors are looking at the responses of the victim. So that's obviously, there's a lot of other research out there on perpetrators. There's a lot of that stuff, but that's what they're looking at, and kind of drawing together a bunch of the research and saying, what are the things we actually know? How do we know them? Which is quite useful. And they make the point that there's not a lot of consistency in methodology or in how people use the terms. So it's very hard to compare, and it's very hard to kind of combine the information. So everything in there, like, grain of salt, but it has a lot of interesting things in it. For example, they found that in the situation, the internal psychological factors of the victim make a bigger difference to the type of response that they're going to do rather than the environmental factors, with the exception of the relationship to the person who's attacking them. And that's kind of a really important thing, because in martial arts and self-defense, we sometimes tend to focus a bit on, like, stranger danger. Yeah. Right. And, we know it's actually often people that the person knows, and the research says clearly that's going to affect how they respond. So teaching people a bunch of, like, murder, death, kill techniques for if the stranger jumps out of the bushes is fine, but that's the person you thought you were your friend. That might create some dissonance, and that might cause you to glitch. Yeah. And they're finding that, assertive responses are generally more effective than non-assertive responses. They talked about some of the things, like people with previous history of victimization are at higher risk. And it's not clear if that's because they were at higher risk to begin with, that's why they were previously victimized, or if it's a result. That's not clear yet from the research. There might have been more stuff since then. I didn't find any a couple of years ago. But so it's basically they're looking at the things that we can find out about how these things happen. And they have interesting methods, because obviously it's really hard to do ethical experiments on this, right? You can't just take a control group and say, okay, half of you are going to be randomly attacked in the next 6 months, and half of you aren't, and then we'll see what happens, and we're going to train some of you and not train some. You can't really do that. So they do things like they ask people stuff has previously happened to. They do hypothetical scenarios. They even do some stuff with virtual reality, they're all really cool methods, and they all give you information, but you have to be careful with the context, because there's always, when you're asking people what happened, there's memory distortions. And when you're asking people what they would do, there's social desirability bias and things like this that can very easily creep in. So it's very valuable information. It's not gospel truth. Yeah.
Well, what I found interesting, what you just said is that there seems to be a correlation with previous victimization, and this is such a difficult topic to talk about, especially when it pertains to women and women's self-defense, because we live in very different times than even only 5 years ago, and the way, again, you're not supposed to be victim blaming. I've literally have been told that I shouldn't teach women to defend themselves, because then I'm victim blaming. It's like don't teach women to defend themselves. That is quite true, and underneath it says teach your sons not to rape. And I'm standing there like, okay, so what you're saying is that until we get to this utopia of a world where rape doesn't exist anymore, because we have taught all boys to not do that, which is a false premise in my mind to begin with, because I have yet to find any father who teaches his sons that rape is the best thing ever and it's a great thing, we should all do that. Pretty much universally, rape is reviled and looked at as a horrible crime. But again, by the time we get to that utopia, however long it takes, and it looks like it's going to be a while, in the meantime, you're okay with all the women having zero self-defense skills. which means that a lot more of them will be victimized than if we, how about do both? Try to find a way that we can stop offenders from doing that, while at the same time giving women a fighting chance to maybe prevent it. And like you just said, the research says that, assertive responses tend to be more favorable in many ways. And it doesn't even have to get to that point, but just by knowing things like, well, there's a good chance you actually know the person. So I'm always floored by that assumption that, it's victim blame. I'm like, no, it's about responsibility. And again, this is a hot button topic nowadays, but I'm like, look, I've talked about this with one activist a while ago, and I said, look, go to your insurance documents and look up the negligence clause. There's going to be a negligence clause in there. It's not going to be called negligence clause, but there will be wording in there that basically boils down to, if you are negligent, then it's on you and we don't pay you a dime. That is the end result. For instance, car insurance. If you leave your car door open and everything gets stolen on the inside, if you think they're going to pay you the insurance, you are wrong. If they can prove that your car door was open, you were negligent, which is not the same thing as saying you're to blame that somebody stole it, but you were negligent with your property. And the same thing applies in many areas of the law, actually, when it comes to people, property, and so on. And then we get to the whole point, well, a woman should be allowed to wear a short skirt and walk into the bad neighborhood at night. I was like, she should be allowed, she should be fine, but since when is that a good idea? And the way I explain them to people is, look, you teach your children to look left and right before they cross the street, right? Right. Even at a zebra crossing. Yes. Why? Well, car might come racing down and not stop, and then they can choose not to cross the street. Like, it's the exact same thing. That car is not supposed to drive too fast. The driver is supposed to pay attention and not be on his cell phone. But your kid, if your kid then says like, well, I'm gonna cross the street anyway, and then if I die, I die, and he gets run over and he dies, is that a good outcome? Or would the good outcome be, even though it is my right and not my fault if I get run over, maybe if I just wait until that idiot passes me by, and again, then you take responsibility for your own actions, your own safety, and he is still at fault for driving too fast. He's still wrong. You're not to blame for whatever he did, but you are responsible for you. Nobody else can be. And that just drives me, again, I'm ranting, but it drives me up the wall with those people. And getting back to my original point, like previous victimization, many years ago, I was teaching women's self-defense courses, and I had somebody in my class who I would call a professional victim, from childhood on, being victimized and so on. Professional victim sounds bad. It's not meant that, I don't mean that she wanted to be one, but more that it just throughout her life, she systematically was victimized in various ways. And I worked a lot with her. Also outside of class, tried to help her. And some things clicked, and she became empowered when she figured out, like, if I do this and I can actually land that technique on this guy, he's going to get off me. If I can do this to the teacher, then I can do this to somebody else as well. Again, if I can do it, if I'm not knocked out, if the blah, blah, blah. So all the qualifiers are there. Anyway, so I hadn't seen her in a while. And then like 3-4 years later, I just ran into her in a totally different city, and she looked like a different person. And she came up to me and said, I want to thank you again because you changed my life, blah, blah, blah. And it's always very nice as an instructor to hear that kind of stuff. And the person I was with then was also in my class, and she said, like, I remember her very differently. And I said, me too. She's changed, and she's taken charge of her life, and good things have started to happen. Not in the woo-woo kind, but just like she was no longer a victim. She was going to fight back, and she was going to take action. So that's why I find that really interesting that the studies also clearly show that previous victimization plays a huge role in what might happen to you. Long rant, back to you, Dan.
Right, there's a bunch of stuff there. I actually took some notes so I can hit all the points, because that's a really interesting thing. So first, one more bit on the research with regards to previous victimization. I'm sure there's more, but there's one specific finding I remember where they ran people through a hypothetical scenario that was progressively getting more likely that there was a problem.
Yeah.
And seeing when they would say, no, I need to leave.
Yeah.
And generally, that was one of the correlates of people with previous history of victimization were less likely to leave earlier. Now, again, the direction of causation is not obvious, and that's a problem with a lot of research, right? But that was one of the things, and I think there's a lot of we can speculate on the reasons. Like I don't know any definitive research on what the reasons are, but from a lot of it is stuff that happens to you under stress really stays with you, right? Particularly if someone is victimized early, passive response might be their only option.
Yeah.
And then that condition's really hard potentially.
Yeah.
And that happens to everyone. We tend to. It tends to be a little bit more visible when it happens to women, but you see the same thing in men. You see the same thing in people who are not binary, which also don't appear very much in the research, by the way, because it's so women focused. So it's not just we don't care about the men, we don't care about anyone who's not. I mean, that's not fair to say, but most of the research, because of where the funding comes from, is specifically women.
If I can interject very quickly on that one. So one of the examples of that is people who suffer abuse in a family setting. They cannot leave, especially when they are minors. They can't get out of there, which means that a survival strategy is often, like you said, freezing and being passive, not resisting, taking the beating literally or figuratively, depending on what kind of abuse it is, because that's the only thing that they can do. They have no resources. They can't fight back. They can never win. They can't get away. They don't have allies. They have nothing. It's just like, if you want to survive this until you're old enough to get out of there, then not fighting is sometimes the best option. And like you said, once that is hardwired into you due to having to do that over and over under extreme stress, it's incredibly difficult to get away from that.
It's anyone who suffered even mild or relatively mild childhood abuse. It takes a while to get over that. If you're training, it takes a while to react to more force than you expect with fighting back, rather than with becoming more passive. That's one of the tells. The other interesting piece with the research was you mentioned that we see self-defense training working. So there's one really interesting one that's been done in a program that they rolled out in, I want to say Kenya. I might be wrong about that. I have to look into it. Where there was a very high level of victimization among schoolgirls. Yeah. And they did a really cool program. This is one where maybe I should find the link and send it to you, and you can put it in the show notes. I don't remember exactly what it was called, but they trained local women to teach them, and it wasn't like a years of training. It was like 6 weeks, and if the research is accurate, the results are spectacular. Like the victimization dropped massively. They tracked like which people, victimization rates before. They used questionnaires, but they made some effort to make sure that they were appropriate for the situation. And they tracked afterwards people who weren't victimized anymore, what strategies they used, like physical, verbal, both. The only thing they didn't track was avoidance strategies, but I guess that's not what they were going for. But it's really interesting. And that, as far as I know, the program also does both. So it's like 6 weeks or so, 5 of them are teaching the girls strategies, and then 1 week is like talking to the boys about consent and stuff like this, which is important. Like we shouldn't say that's not important. That it's an important conversation to have, because navigating consent is a skill.
Obviously,
And like one of the places where bad things happen, or we hear about it anyway, is college campuses. And part of the reason is because people who go there often, they're still working out how to navigate relationships and that sort of thing. And it's important that there's some guidance on how to do that safely from both sides.
Well, again, quickly about that, and like you mentioned, college campuses, it's a good example. This is one where I heard so many people talk about, teach your sons not to rape. I'm like, okay, do you lock your doors? Yes. Okay. Stop locking your doors. Teach thieves not to steal. It doesn't make sense. And even if we get to the point where, actually we have to teach people not to steal, I'm in agreement. In the meantime, we will still lock our doors, right? And then we put a consistent effort into teaching that stealing is wrong, and we try to address that issue. And just like you said, you have to have the talks with especially young men when they hit their teenage years and the hormones drive them crazy. You have to teach them, okay, this is how it works. I had that talk with my son. I said, look, okay, so you don't hit a woman just that is simply unacceptable behavior. This and this and this. If she says no, it's no. If she says yes, it's yes. At any time, she can change a yes to a no. That's how this works. Once you are in a relationship, it's going to be maybe a little bit different, but even then she can still switch to no. If she says no, you're done for the night. Get out of there. Leave right now. Because she's not feeling comfortable. Something made her change her mind. Leave her the hell alone. Give her space. And it stays no from that point on. And you go away. There will be plenty of other girls that you can meet, and yet there's a bunch of stuff that I covered there that I think is, I don't know about your dad, but my dad died when I was 18, so I didn't I don't know if he had planned that talk with me, but he sure never got to it. So I don't know how many fathers actually talk at length. My kids said that I was an atypical father when they compared me to their friends' dads. I'm like, okay, I'll take that. They also said I was not normal, but I'll accept that as well. But I don't know many fathers who actually go into more like, not just don't be stupid, don't get arrested, don't do this, but more like, okay, why? This is how it works and why this is important.
Hopefully more now, like with culture changing and a little bit more awareness on that, I'm hoping that becomes a little bit more prevalent. We used to do this at the dojo, like when because I had a bunch of teenagers training, and we didn't just do like no means no. We did, this is how boundary setting works, from that side, but also you need to respect the boundaries, and here's how you do that, and here's what that looks like. And we went with my recommendation is, it's either hell yes, they're really enthusiastic, or it's we're done for the night,
Yeah.
But I think it's that the reason there's lots of reasons that this is a hot button topic, and I think it's actually important that it's a conversation that is had.
Yeah.
Because it can be, for example, if universities made self-defense training mandatory, I think that would be a very different story. Then you can talk about, or when you hear some people in the self-defense industry who kind of seem to advocate that this is like the solution to the problem. Everyone gets self-defense training and the problem is solved. Like, that's not how it works. But even one argument, for example, for this, and this is this is a semi-government report that's kind of written as a research paper. That I generally don't like it, but it has a lot of really good information. And this is a tip if you're reading research papers, see what information you can find that's useful. Don't try to find why you can dismiss it, because usually things you won't like have useful stuff. But this one, for example, if you follow the recommendations, you or me would not be allowed to teach self-defense because we're men. Right. But one of the things in there that's really good, they were talking about this argument that, against self-defense because it's an individual intervention, like it only helps individuals. Like, well, so does prosecution. You still prosecute bad guys. But back to the hot button topic thing is, I think if you're teaching, it's an important thing to address, first of all, because you don't want your students to, if you have someone who something's happened to, you want to be clear that it wasn't their fault. Yeah. And also because you want people to actually listen to what you say. Like, if you come in there and you don't want to be part of the problem, when a self-defense instructor, a bad self-defense instructor goes and says, well, it's your own fault because of how you dressed, it damages everyone, right? It damages the whole industry, the credibility. So we don't want that, and it's terrible for the people who are listening to that, especially if something's happened to them previously. It's also bad advice. Yeah. So we have to be careful. So I do teach courses for universities, and I always make it a point to do a couple of things. If I have a topic that's controversial, for example, clothing, I make sure that I can explain why it's important and to what degree, and what some of the misconceptions are where this comes from. It comes from that it's controversial. I haven't had a problem yet. I've had people who were at the beginning, when I asked who thinks, is it important what someone wears, and who thinks it's not important, practically dislocating their arms saying, and then I go, okay, it's important, but let me explain why. And then afterwards I'll go like, okay, does that make sense? Like, are we on the same page? Like, yes, that totally makes sense. Yep. You have to get into the explanation. The second thing I do is that I make sure that I say in the beginning, this is not a prescriptive course. Like, if something bad happens, I'm not there and you're adults. I'm here to give you information. If you ask me directly, I will recommend courses of action, but my job is to give you skills and give you information. and you make your own choices, and just be careful. Like, I say this is a risk factor. I'm not saying don't do this. I'm saying like this is a risk factor. And the other one I do, and this is specifically for colleges, that I will ask people, what do you think is a factor in how someone gets targeted? Because another one that's become controversial is alcohol.
Yep.
And it's like, well, what do you think? And every group comes up with alcohol. And then I don't have the issue of, oh, but, you're saying alcohol, are you blaming? It's like, no, I'm not blaming anyone. I'm very clear on that, but I'm giving you guys know this. You know it's a factor. Yeah. And college campus is an interesting one because like last time I was teaching, and this was over Zoom because during the pandemic, the university actually had a social media thing with survivor stories. So before I'm doing my homework, I'm doing my research, and I'm checking, those research skills, putting them to use and going, okay, so this is the stuff that actually seems to happen there. And a lot of it isn't things that your standard martial arts have a good solution to. Like a lot of this is you're not going to kick or punch your way out of this. And then you also see some commonality, some things that people say over and over and over. Like I didn't know how to say no is a really common one. He was banging up my door in the middle of the night and I wanted to let him in, or she was, because it goes both ways, right? And I didn't want to let them in, but I didn't know what else to do. And so it's like, okay, this has to be in the course. Like we have to address these things that actually happen. I think that, as we talked earlier, reality-based self-defense, I think it's a lot of things that fall under that label. It's easy to lose sight of it, that it has to be the reality of the students that you have. Yeah. Stuff that is like, I know you have this great article on the myth of military hand combat systems. Just because something is real for someone somewhere, or even worse, because you saw it in a movie, doesn't mean that that's going to be useful for your students. Like generally, people on college campuses don't need stuff that is like Jason Bourne stuff. They need specific stuff for their situation, particularly with soft skills, right? Yeah. With like, what's the boundaries and, what are the resources available? Because generally there's more resources than people realize. And what can you do? And like, so I think it's these hot button topics, they're conversations that we should have. Obviously, there's some people you can't really talk to because they're already in their, from either side, they're already in their mindset. But whenever we can talk to people, it's important to have conversations. It's important to acknowledge it's an important topic. But also you still have to, like, you can't let that compromise your training. Like, if someone is offended by something that's in the training, I'm going to look at it. Yeah. But if that's a thing that's like, this is important for this to work, I'm like, I'm sorry, maybe I'm not the person you need to be training with. I know some people who are who've gone further in making their training sort of more
politically correct.
Acceptable. Let me say acceptable.
Acceptable. Okay.
Who are good, like, and I will happily put you in touch with them. Yeah. But like, I know what the things that I'm good at and that I'm not good at, and I know what I need for my training to work. Yeah. So
no, that makes perfect sense. Did you have other notes that you want to cover? Because you said you had a few. You took phone.
Yes. Notes. Just one more thing, because you said this thing with the life changing, right? Because I've had a similar experience. I wasn't the teacher at a course, but I was involved. And we had a student who was doing really well with all the physical and struggling with the boundary setting, Yeah. And we ran into them again a year later, and they were like, "Thank you, you changed my life. Like, this is, you taught me how to." And I think that's one of the, my website's called Harm and Harmony for a reason, because I think that, like, for Aikido specifically, there should be a martial core, but also a lot of people kind of just want to throw out all the spiritual and self-development stuff, and I think that's a mistake, because even for self-defense, you still kind of need that, because there are some people when they show up to training, even the idea that I'm worth defending, that's an end goal for them. That's not there's not a starting point. There's some people, they show up and they're like, all they need is to know what to do. They just need some physical techniques and they're good. Yeah. But there's a lot of people where there is work. Like, yeah. And I think that, one of the things martial arts are really good for is because, and why I personally think why martial arts are really useful for this, is that these ideas, these philosophical ideas, they're not just things you study. If your martial art makes sense as a complete system, they're in the way that the movements work, and they're in the drills, and they're in what you do, and that makes it much easier to kind of use it for self-development. Because you can learn about philosophy anywhere. You don't need to come to a martial arts class for this, but Aikido, to give a specific example, people always talk about like calming down and being calm under pressure and being all peaceful. Well, you don't get that by reading a bunch of Ushiba's books. Like, that might help. You get that by actually training that physically while someone is trying to get you.
Yeah.
Well, and that gets you there.
Yeah, this is one of the drills that I do when I teach a self-defense class. I don't do it always, but because it depends on how much time I have. One of the drills is that I ask somebody who can, be really aggressive and really loud and curse at me for 30 seconds or a minute straight. And then I go down on my knees, so I'm a lot smaller, and they get really close. And then I said, go. Somebody checks the time, and for like a minute, they just yell every curse word at me that you can think. And I tell them, just don't hold back. The only thing you're not allowed to do is touch me. But you can yell at me and call me as many names as you like. And then when the timekeeper says time, they stop, and I say, thank you, sir, I understand, but I'm sorry, I can't help you if you're going to behave that way. And I'm very calm. For most people, that is already a stress level. Well, for many people, let's say, that's already a stress level that is so beyond anything that they are used to. They have auditory exclusion, maybe they have tunnel vision and so on. And there's a drill that I sometimes do is again, depending on context, when I do have somebody else do that first, and then I have a lot of stuff going on in the background that he's supposed to see. It's in his field of vision. Nothing. Tunnel vision, and did you see that happen? Did you see that? No. And then I said, look, okay, this is how violence works. If you experience tunnel vision to this degree just by somebody shouting at you, what do you think will happen when the punches actually start flying? Do you think it's going to go away magically all of a sudden? And we can train for that. We can get better at that. But this is like giving you a glimpse of what violence is like in the safest possible way. Anyway, my point is that just getting used to these kind of things and being exposed to them is a good thing. But like we were talking about, we're living in very different times now. I can imagine that I will get some complaints that I triggered people into whatever if I would do that with anybody just out of the blue. So I don't.
I mean, I'm stealing that drill, by the way.
Go ahead.
100%. That sounds really good. I mean, there's benefits. There's a book I really like. It's called Fear is the Mind Killer.
Yeah.
I think by Kaya Sandowski. I think I'm bad at pronouncing the last name. I've met them. They're really cool people at Valkyrie, and that addresses really well how to structure policies so that people know what to expect.
Yep.
And so that you can avoid that to some degree. And I love this book because it's very non-preachy. Like a lot of things that go into that direction, they're very preachy. This, you can take it. It has lots of stuff in there, keeping in mind that you also need to run a school, and you need to have that be successful. And you can use it if you have a completely different point of view from the authors. So I that's something that I think is really helpful for, I do a fairly comprehensive safety talk before seminars.
Yeah.
And that includes an emotional safety. This is the topics we're going to talk about. This is the words we're going to use. I don't go through every word, but this is how we're going to talk about them.
Yeah.
Which in my case is based upon research that I've read, that I have a idea of how I want to talk about things. If something is, I'm going to quote another instructor here. If something is dark and sharp and sucks, then the language should reflect that. And that might not be appropriate for every group. That's changeable, but whatever level that's going to be, it's in the safety talk. And every once in a while, someone goes, okay, this is not for me. It's
and
great.
that's fine.
That is great self-defense to have that boundary of going, this is too much for me and I want to leave. It's great. If you want a refund, let me know. And fantastic. I don't have any problem with that. But people should know what to expect. I think people shouldn't walk into training and then be bombarded with something that,
Sure.
It's we never said we were going to do this.
Yeah. Well, the thing for me mostly is that it boils down to, how do you teach somebody about how to handle violence when they have no experience with violence, but they do have a lot of preconceived notions on how you should handle it. And this is a typical example. It's what? No, I don't want to learn about it this way. This is the wrong way. Not necessarily because they have been victimized or traumatized or anything, just because it doesn't fit their worldview of well, I don't want to think like that. I've literally had somebody say that to me, I don't want to be like that. And my point was that, and I said, and this was a teenage girl, I said, it's not about being like that. It is about understanding that no matter how much you would like it not to be, the world is a dangerous place, and you run a realistic risk of eventually being faced with somebody who doesn't have good intentions with you, quite on the contrary. And she actually experienced something like that later on, that kind of helped her readjust her mindset and her worldview a little bit to be more protective of herself, emotionally, psychologically, and so on. Because having experienced a bad actor who was out to hurt, then all of a sudden your world shifts. And like we said, I think the research paper in your blog post also mentions that, is that your worldview basically before the incident also is going to determine the outcome.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a difficult topic, I think. I mean, there's a quote I like, and it's from a marketing book, which is speaking respectfully to someone's worldview is the price of entry to get their attention.
Yep.
And there's a limit on that, obviously. Like there's some worldviews that you like, we don't have a common ground. I'm sorry. Like, I mean, again, I've told you my approach. This is your choices. This is not prescriptive. If this is not for you, I will try to find you someone who fits better with that. And if I have the time, we'll have a conversation of, it always depends. What you're going to put in determines the outcome. There's a certain that you can get pretty far in improving your personal safety without ever having to put hands on somebody.
Yep.
Like there's a lot of gains in that. If you're not comfortable with that, there's still a lot of gains you can do. There's going to be a point of failure. And even like now when I was teaching over Zoom, I said, look, we're not going to do anything physical because this is over the internet.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about it because there were some questions at the end. So it's like, okay, this is just the very limited things I will say. But like, there's a limit to what you can do that way. And that's okay. And that's just make sure it's a choice. Like make sure you're making, and I'm not saying if you make that choice, bad things will happen to you. I'm really not saying if you make that choice, bad things should happen to you. All I'm saying is that when, there you can go so far and everything else might require something different. Yeah. And one of the things that I like, Aikido gets a lot of crap. People say it's not good for self-defense and things like this. I think that's a whole different conversation around that. But which I've actually had with Randy King on his debate thing. So maybe that would be another good link to put in there. Cool. But one thing it's useful for is because people show up who maybe have a more peaceful worldview to begin with.
Yeah.
Right. And people who aren't necessarily going to be comfortable walking into a high intensity class or a class where the public image of the art or the style of the training is kind of very macho combative. And then, you can have people stay within that to a degree, but still make it practical martially and still work in the self-defense and have a sort of a gradual shift, if that is their choice, towards being more comfortable with, I actually understand that violence is an ugly, ugly thing sometimes. And, and I like Aikido has this thing about not harming the attacker. To my interpretation of that is not harming the person more than you need to. Like there's a level of my safety comes first. I'm going to keep myself safe. And then beyond that, I'm not going to use gratuitous violence. I'm just going to use what I need to defend myself. And that's what I'm trying to instill. But that what you need part is really important.
Yeah, and we were talking about that before we started recording when it comes to Aikido. Like you said, sure, many people, again, like we mentioned, want to be like O-sensei when he was older, and about his religious beliefs and so on, and he talked about love and harmony. Aikido is love and so on. Nobody wants to be like he was when he was younger, or they want to do the kind of training he did while he was younger. And we mentioned the book about the Aikido masters, the pre-war era, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Excellent book. I read it years ago, and this is about O-sensei's students before the Second World War. What he was like, what it was like to train with him. People forget, he was strong. He was a muscular guy. It was not about love and flowing. He was a harsh teacher. He would basically beat up his students. And his teacher was a rough man as well. So this whole concept of being, all about love and harmony and so on came later. I know about his religious beliefs and so on, that it wasn't just at the end of his life and so on, but in his art was brutal at first and then evolved as he evolved over time. And my point is always that if you see the guy at the end of his life and what he could do then, and you want to get there, but you do not want to go through the same kind of training, you want to skip that part, how is that realistic? That doesn't make any sense. That's the first part. And the second part is you're cherry picking, because he also said that atemi, striking, is an essential part. It's like, what is it, like 90%, or I forget what he said. It was a lot, like a high percentage of Aikido is atemi. Go ahead.
I hate that quote.
You hate it? Oh, nice. Let's go.
Just because, like, if you look at the pre-war masters, and if you look at any footage of Aikido from back then, if you read any interviews, I can't find any indication that they made it a part of training that would like fit that. Yeah. So he may have said it. I haven't had a primary thing where he said it. It's through another teacher, but I don't think they actually trained like that. So how he meant it is open to interpretation.
Well, let me give you my interpretation first, and then maybe it'll make more sense. The way like I said, I used to have a good friend. We're not friends anymore, but I used to have a friend who I explained it to you, but maybe the listeners haven't heard it. We used to be we had the same teacher, different school, and our teacher liked to have us fight each other. So we would fight a lot, couldn't stand each other. He moved to a different country, came back. We had one more big fight, and then we became friends. So he was a bouncer there, and the first thing he did was would punch people when they needed punching, because it was in a pretty bad part of town, a rough area. And then the owner said, "You can't punch anymore because you're knocking everybody out." He says, "Okay." He starts kicking people in the head. "No, you can't kick anymore. You're knocking people out." He says, "Fine." So he started headbutting people. Can't do that anymore either after a while, because he's knocking too many people out. So he's like, "What the hell?" And he picks up Aikido with a teacher, and he went all in. Like, I think he trained like 5-6 hours a day. So very quickly started using Aikido as a bouncer against people who were trying to, basically mess him up. And that was like a rugby town. So, and for anybody who doesn't know, like a rugby player, getting punched for a rugby player, it's not really a big deal. They think that American football players are pussies for all the protective gear that they're wearing. So watch some rugby, and if you think it's still silly, go do a friendly training session with those guys. See how you like it.
I used to play rugby in high school. That I think has helped me with training quite a bit.
Anyway, so my point is that I talked about it with him, and one of the points that he made is that every joint lock, every movement you see that looks like it's just a joint lock or a takedown or whatever is backed up by a punch. If the joint lock isn't there, you get the punch, the elbow, the whatever. And that's the way I view it. Is I interpret what supposedly, let's say, Osensei said that it's all Aikido, because he took so much from sword. Mm-hmm. And then it's that the technique is strike the opponent, cut him down. And if you take the analogy to striking, it's then, okay, so you throw a punch at me. I am going to put on this joint lock to control you and restore harmony and love you because I don't want to hurt you. If that doesn't work, you will eat my fist. To put it in a very disrespectful and blunt manner, but there's a backup plan. There's a fail-safe, if you want. There's something added to it. And again, I'm not an Aikido practitioner, so you are, so correct me if I'm wrong, but what I see too often happening is that people either don't know or don't train that backup part. Like the punch isn't there. And they've adjusted the technique in such a way that you cannot even throw whatever backup punch that was supposed to be there. And 100%. Along with a lot of other stuff. Anyway, that was it. Go.
100%. So I completely agree with that interpretation. Like there's a couple of different ones. Like Ellis Samdur in his book, he talks about a different translation of the word atemi. So he means it as like whole body kind of decisive movement, which is and like body power integration, which is I don't know if I agree with that, but I think it's a valid thing to look at. But I'm similar to you. The way I see it is that there's other stuff that happens around the Aikido technique. Like what my teacher likes to say is the other person has a choice. Like their choice can be that I do Aikido, which can be nice and not hurt them, or they can make a different choice. But that only works if you also have the training. And that's one thing I like to say about Aikido is, again, tying back to the stuff that Sensei did versus what he was like at the end of his life. So if you look at, technically the differences weren't that many, but the attitude was quite different. And one of the things that you find is that when he started started teaching people, a lot of people he taught already had martial arts experience, often quite extensive. So they already knew how to fight, or at least what a fight looked like.
Yep.
Even around the warriors, a lot of people had military experience in various Japanese things. So these were not people who needed, this is what a fight looks like 101.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one other thing with, like, if Aikido is so non-practical as some people claim, how come all these high-ranking judoka and people were going to train with this guy? He apparently had regular interactions for a while with Masoyama, the founder of Kyokushinkai. Yeah. That's not someone who's impressed by some people falling over when you wave your hand. That's not so. But one of the problems that you then get, of course, is that what that means is that often the training that you do in Aikido doesn't build that fundamental, like that base, that fundamental fighting skill.
Well, in my opinion, it should. If you have a good teacher, that should be an integral part of it. But then we get to, and I said that before we start recording, I do Tai Chi Chuan. I teach it. It's the main style that I've been practicing for the last 25 years. I mean, if there is ever an art that we can say that the vast majority of people who practice it do not practice it as a martial art, Tai Chi would apply. I never learned any. The only reason I started training in it is because somebody said that no, they actually fight these guys. Because I thought, no, that's just for old people. And like, oh wow, here's somebody who can actually make it work. But the point is that from the very first lesson, it was taught as a martial art. If you have to add that on later on, I think you will inevitably run into problems. And then we get back to finding a good teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it should be part of the training, but then you have to make space for it in the training. Like, you can't just take the kind of shape of the techniques and like the kind of, I don't like the expression, but higher level principles, like the stuff that's supposed to be built on a base, and expect that to also give you a fighting base. Yeah. You can add it later. I mean, that was kind of, I started with the Aikido. I didn't start with the sort of cliched thing is you start with a contact style like judo or grappling or boxing or something, and then you go to the internal arts. I did it the other way around, which is in some ways more complicated. And for me, my goal isn't that fighting base. For me is supposed to be self-defense. Like, I'm very clear that that's my focus. You can make fighting, those are different things, but for me, I want that to be self-defense, but you do have to make space for that in the training, because it's not, my teacher argues that it should be built in. Yeah. And he's actually taking some steps to put that into his training, but it's, a lot of the training that you see out there, there's somewhere that's in there, but a lot of it isn't, and you have to be kind of realistic about what you're doing. Yeah. Right? Like, if you want to, I know enough people who've used Aikido for real that it's not, the story falls apart if it's not usable. Completely falls apart, right? But it depends on how you train. It depends on what exactly you're doing in class. That's all that matters at the end. You could have MMA written on the door if you don't actually do the bits of MMA that turn you into a competent fighter. I know someone who did MMA and never sparred in their training somehow and went to a competition and it didn't go well for them. Yeah. It's just because there's certain thing is written on the door. What matters is what happens in training.
Well, I think Aikido suffers from the same thing that many Chinese martial arts suffer, in particular, is that the training methods, when viewed from the outside, look fake as hell. Like, one of the big issues I see people criticizing Aikido for is like the big falls. The uke is always falling. He's doing these spectacular falls and this and that. That would never happen in real life. So that's not the point. The point is that for the teacher to do that technique correctly, if he does it with the martial components in there, the student A is going to follow that fall and take the fall correctly. And as you know, some of the techniques, you need a really good uke who knows how to fall, because not everybody can pull it off. Either he knows how to fall and basically accepts that he will fall and help you along, not in the sense that do the technique for you, but
take a good fall, or, you're going to destroy his wrist, his elbow, his shoulder, whatever, break his neck. Something gets destroyed because of the mechanics of the lock or the technique that you're doing. So those are the choices. So to practice safely, he's going to do a spectacular fall. Same thing with many other arts, same thing with a lot of weapon arts, is that no, you can't just do whatever you like, because you're going to take a sword to the face. And we practice with not necessarily sharpened swords, but even a blunt sword, taking it into the eye socket, you'll be blind at best. So no, you can't just like swing your weapon around and do whatever you like. There needs to be some sort of safety protocol. And the analogy that I always use is that, okay, so you think this is bullshit? Fine. I want you to go to a firing range and pick up your firearm and start waving it about and do whatever you want with it and see how many seconds it takes the range master to kick your ass out and literally grab the weapon from you, maybe even violently control you and then kick you out, because that's what's going to happen. And this is all lethal force, because any child can pull a trigger. Right? So every single weapon you see there is lethal. And everybody who trains there knows that. So they train for lethal force. The stakes don't get much higher. And what you get there, protocol, safety protocol, constantly, every single time that I go to the shooting range or go, especially when I'm in the US, go shooting with friends, so you know the drill. I said, no, let's go over it again. We just go over it again. These are the rules, blah, 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 and so on. And I'm like, so if it works, having very specific safety considerations and protocols so nobody gets dead or injured for firearms, where the stakes are the highest, your argument is that we shouldn't have that for something where the stakes are maybe a little bit lower, like you get a broken elbow? Like, I don't get that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of, these safety mechanisms that are built into their training, they kind of regard as the default.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So, the Judo and Aikido both have, they look superficially fairly similar. Yeah. They have similar types of break falls. The training is very different, but the safety mechanisms are also very different.
Yeah.
But like the thing is that good partner training is incredibly important to Aikido, because this training method, like one of my sort of things I don't like about a lot of the Aikido practice is that you don't really have a lot of drilling. All you have is repetition of partner attacks. You do the technique, and it's usually cooperative, and that's nice. But it's useful to have other stuff in there as well. So good partner training is necessary for that, and it's really, really important. And sometimes that's to make the instructor look good.
Yeah.
Right? You see there's some people who do spectacularly cool stuff in demonstrations. And people look at that and either go, this is amazing, or this is fake. And for both cases, it's like, well, it's not. What it is the partner is doing a lot of the work. Like, it's still amazing, right? And it's not fake. It wouldn't look like that with a different partner. They're just doing a lot of the work. But, and the downside is this training method, you can get very good training that way, but it doesn't force you to.
Yeah.
By having a cooperative partner, you can also get away with a lot of kind of bullshit, because you can teach people what they're supposed to be doing in response to what you're doing. And then it doesn't matter if that's actually good, but there are advantages. I've seen few arts that have mechanics for locks that are as good as Aikido, just simply because when you have a good enough partner, you can practice actually moving your body through the lock and things like that.
Exactly. And that was the point that I wanted to make. It's that you could actually, this is like in BJJ, they always talk about that. Yeah, but we train the way we fight. You could actually go, all out with your lock. You just have to stop when he taps. Mm-hmm. So we train like we would actually use it. I'm like, well, that's the exact same thing Aikido does, but because it's different kind of techniques, there's no tap, there's no time to tap. So you need to take a good fall then. But you are actually, if you've got a good teacher, you have all the necessary components to train it as a martial art, then sure, when you do Nikki or whatever, and you do it like a madman, and the partner doesn't know what's coming and it doesn't know how to handle it, you're going to mess up his arm. Yeah. But you still need to be able to practice correctly. So again, safety mechanisms.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things we used to do at the dojo is that when a new person would come in, for techniques with a safe, I would be like, look, I'm not going to teach you how you're supposed to respond to this for like the first 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Just so, and this is not for your benefit, this is for everybody else, so that they can feel like, what does, obviously we're only with things where that's safe, but so they can feel, what does it feel like when you do this to someone who hasn't trained? Because one of the dangers of having that as a method is that people think that that's what it actually feels like when you do it for real. And then when you try that and that's not what happens, you kind of freeze up because you don't know what to do. And again, this is also where backup plan comes in.
Yeah.
The other thing is, of course, that the things that you see a lot of because they look spectacular in demonstrations aren't necessarily the things that are the most practical. Yeah. They're also not necessarily the things that you focus on the most. Like one example I use is wrist locks. Aikido is known for them. We only really have like 4 or 5. It's just we don't have that many techniques in total, and the rest is like variations on these. But when somebody asks, show me some Aikido, what am I going to do? I'm not going to throw them. I'm going to be like, grab my wrist, boom, that hurts. You can see, you feel that. Here it is. And the other thing to consider with the break fall specifically is that, they look unrealistic, but here's the thing: I have to take 100 of these things a night if I'm training. Yeah. Like I'm going to make sure that especially those soft falls you see. The point is not because that's the most realistic way to fall. The point is because I have to do that another 99 times after. And, people, one thing that drives me crazy is when people are like, oh, you don't need to be fit to do this, is like, what they usually mean is, oh, sensei wasn't fit at the end of his life. And the technique can work for people who are not, like, you don't need to be, whim to do this. You're not the small human, right?
No.
But it still has demands on the body, and you still need to take care of your body for training because, that was one of the mistakes I made, is because when I started, I was told you don't need to be fit for this. And I have some minor mid to medium long-term injuries that didn't need to be there because I was like, oh, okay, that's fine then. It's like, no, actually, you need to take really good care of your body in some ways because you're going to be taking a lot of falls. You're going to have stuff done to your joints that they were so not designed for.
Yeah. When I started with judo and jiu-jitsu, the way I learned break falls is that quick demonstration, like lie on your side on the mat and slap the mat a few times, and then it was like do the break fall from from a kneeling position on your haunches, from like a low squat, and then I like the lesson afterwards, I had to take the gi of my training partner, grab his lapels. Hold on tight, and he would sweep me off my feet, and I'd have to let go from like pretty high, and then do a massive break fall. And I was like, this sucks. And then we had to do like jumping over and rolling, and like I was a white belt, so I remember messing up one of those break falls and really landing badly on my back, and I couldn't breathe. And I was like, half dying, and they put me on the side and like, okay, take a breath and so on. So that was old school training. But again, you don't do that forever. If you wanna have a functioning spine, maybe don't do that forever.
Yeah, one thing people don't realize is that most Japanese martial arts did not have a sophisticated system of break falls before judo introduced it.
Yeah. And
the older styles mostly copied judo stuff. So the old school training methods are more like that. But the old school idea is also not that, most students who come through the door are going to stay, right? Yeah. There's definitely a case of selection, and we want the people who are tough enough and, who will pass on the art, because that's what it's really about for us. Especially if you're teaching with self-defense in mind, you might want to do that a little bit differently.
Yeah, and to add to that, something that is very alien to people nowadays, but unless maybe you go to the military, but back in those days, in many societies, but especially maybe in Asia, you were expendable. So like we're going to teach this guy, but we don't expect him to live into old age. So the training methods very often reflected that. When you look at, and again, this is true here thousands of years ago, the Romans, the Greeks, and so on. It's not like they had this perfect system where they would train you gradually following all the scientific training principles that we know now about exercise physiology, how to get maximum performance for as long as you can. It's like, no, we need you to be a tough legionnaire. I'm going to train you. It's going to be harsh, and they would do stuff like, if I'm not mistaken, stuff like, well, you're going to work outside really hard in the rain to get used to the weather. We know that you get sick from that, but they're like, okay, if you survive that, it's fine. If you don't, well, you're clearly not legionnaire material, so we'll get rid of you. So who stays? The strong guys, the guys who would probably have the genetic and the physical makeup to make it anyway. Okay, fine.
Yeah, it's not even that long ago. If you look at the Prussian army stuff from like 19th century and things, it's the similar stories. This is. But I really like what you said there. With one thing that there are people who. It's easy to fall in love with martial arts with the historical side of it, right? And I find that stuff fascinating. Like like you said, those books about the pre-war masters and where it all comes from and older martial arts. It's great. But there are areas where human knowledge has advanced a fair bit, and exercise physiology and coaching are some of those. And there's a great reluctance sometimes to incorporate those. Like we have a pretty good idea of how people learn motor skills and how they don't. We have a pretty good idea of what's a good warm-up and what isn't.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things, like there's a quote in one book, I think it's in Angry White Pajamas, where some instructor goes, our warm-up hasn't changed in 50 years. And as my instructor says, that's not a brag, that's a warning.
Yeah.
We know more about that stuff now. Of course, there are benefits, a lot of benefits to old school training, particularly on the toughening side. And, and you should be a good thing if you're teaching or if you're even looking for a school is to have an idea of what your goal is, because it could be that that's what you want. It could be that's what you want your school to be like. Could be that's what you want to train in. That's great, but don't I get a little annoyed when I see that and people say, no, we're self-defense for everyone. It's like, no, you're not. 80% of people don't go through your beginner's course. That's not. But so as I think getting these coaching and these exercise things into your training, these methods is really, really important, and it's really, really useful.
Yeah.
And there's so many good resources for that out there. One of I think the first book of yours that I read was The Fighter's Body.
Yeah.
That was kind of one of the introductions for me into that side of things.
Well, and that is the book that I would definitely do not want to write again because it took so much research. But if I would have to write it now, I'd have to write it differently because, like you said, this is like, I think, it's almost 20 years ago. So it's my first book with Lauren. And science has changed. Dietary guidelines and nutritional science has changed as well. So there's other stuff that I would put in there. I think, for the vast majority, what is in there is still going to work. It's still going to work for most people. But I talked about this in my previous podcast. Is that the famous interview with Dan Trailescu, when they asked him a question why there were so many sidekick defenses in Jeet Kune Do, he said because when Bruce was developing the system, that's what everybody did, sidekick. Mm-hmm. Now the sidekick is not really something you see all that much. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying it's gone, but compared to other techniques, nobody's going to say, well, sidekick. And that's kind of the point, is that when you look at the historical context of martial arts, well, sure, look at the entire context. Not just that school, that teacher, but no, the entire society, what's going on there. And then you will find a lot of answers, which is, and again, as we're pissing off people, I'm going to piss off some more people. The European fencing arts reenactors and necromancers, as a friend of mine calls them, a lot of those guys, they seem, I can't say it that way. What I have seen is on more than one occasion, people translating old manuscripts, interpreting them with 21st century thinking and understanding, with very much insufficiently incorporating like 14th, 15th, 16th, whatever century understanding, science, quote unquote, that they had, and so on. And just knowing what living in such a time was like. Mm-hmm. And that's where I find I get what you're doing, but I don't really think that this is accurate. But by all means, go ahead. Again, I have nothing against anybody. Anybody can practice in any way they like, and I'm not saying that it wouldn't work. That's not what I'm saying. It's just that it's a pretty big claim to be able to translate something. And we get back to what I just said with my teacher being actually able to translate, from the original language into another language, and having the experience fighting, and being a highly accomplished martial artist. That's a very different position than from somebody who is maybe a good martial artist, but not a good historian. Mm-hmm. So then we have the opposite problem.
I think that's a general thing, with, and I partly blame martial arts movies for this. This idea that a martial arts instructor is somehow good at everything.
Yeah.
People have their I know plenty of really good martial artists who are lousy teachers. I know plenty of people who are really good martial artists, maybe decent teachers. They should not be giving life advice outside of, martial arts. There's lots of people who their training might save your life, but their warm-up is going to hurt you.
Yeah.
You see that a lot. And we talked about this before. Part of the reason I did a counseling degree is because I saw so much of what bordered on mental health advice in martial arts from people that probably shouldn't be giving it.
There's a word for that, and I have it bookmarked. It's called Crepitarianism. And it is the tendency for people to confidently make authoritative pronouncements in matters above or outside their level of knowledge.
Yeah.
And I found that many, many very smart people who are really good at something, even scientists, then go on to do exactly that. And there's many cases here in my country where people scientists who are a lot in the news then somehow feel that their science muscles give them the ability to punch a hole into the argument of a topic that they have no training, no studying, and so on. But I'm a scientist, so I know the scientific method, so I am right and you're not. I call it pulling the science card. And I'm like, I've got these blog posts about arrogance in the martial arts, where it's this. I put a link up there from somebody said what it means to get a PhD, and it ends up you've got this huge circle that represents the entirety of human knowledge, and what you just did is go from the middle into one direction, punch a really small hole into the edge of the circle and expanded the body of knowledge. And he says, look at all the rest there is that you know nothing about, because that's not your PhD, you didn't study that. And how can you be arrogant if you did just that? And again, same thing with martial arts teachers. We see that a lot. I try to not talk about a whole lot of things that I have strong opinions about, because I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I have those opinions, but you don't see me writing about them or podcasting about them at all.
Exactly. I mean, there's things I have opinions about that I would talk to people privately.
Yeah.
But especially if I'm teaching, if I'm in any position where people are more likely to listen on a large scale, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I also don't want to put things in people's heads where this is just an opinion I have. And my qualification to have that opinion is small. Yeah. And I don't think it's an opinion that matters. That's the thing.
Speaking of opinions and actually having what you need to back it up. So you have a master's degree in counseling studies. And you said that you did that to actually be able to address the psychological side of self-defense better. Can you talk a little bit about that? What did those studies bring you that you can now use for self-defense instruction? Sure.
So it gave me more of an appreciation of how the research around it works, which is one thing. So I actually, because I was previously in academia, I had an undergrad degree, but this one really focused on qualitative research. So now I know how to read that stuff. And since a lot of self-defense is in that, so that really helped. I actually did my dissertation on transformational teaching in self-defense. So that was what I researched. I studied some people that we both know.
Okay.
So the things I got out of that kind of helped me shape some opinions of how the relationship between teacher and student is quite important. And what are some of the things that with that? So for example, that it's really important as a teacher that you come in with the assumption that your students are capable. Your students are capable individuals, you're helping them be better. You get a lot of the research points to teachers who come in with the idea that their students are kind of useless without them. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a couple of different mechanisms that go on there. So that's a fairly important part. We've talked about this before with the use of language. For me, the way that you talk about difficult topics is important. It has to be done in a way that's it's become a bit of a buzzword, but trauma aware. but it also you don't want to overcorrect. You want to make sure that you're not walking around on eggshells around people unless that's actually necessary. It's reinforced the idea that population groups that are different than me might have very different needs. So one of the advantages of most of the research being about women's stuff is that there's a lot of information about how self-defense training may or may not help women and what the risk factors are and what the needs are. So I've definitely upped my game in that area by looking at, this is a really good point. There's some stuff on cultural differences. There's one nice paper where they were trying to put together a self-defense program for women in Nepal after the earthquake a couple of years ago. And because they were having problems, and they did almost everything right, but it still didn't work particularly well because a lot of people were pulled out of the program because the families decided it wasn't appropriate for them. So there can be cultural barriers, right? And you have to always be kind of cognizant of that. And like you said before, you have to take context into account, both historical and current. Yeah. There are things that are going on currently that you have to take into account. So that's a way it's helped. It's helped me a lot because the focus was on transformational teaching. I've dug into the teaching and coaching literature a lot. So it's helped with that. It's, we're talking earlier about the way that martial arts are useful for self-development. Well, there's some research on what kinds of teaching are good for that and what the factors are that are important. And one of them, for example, is that it has to be student-centric. So if your primary concern, obviously your primary concern as a teacher is your ego, you shouldn't be there in the first place. But if your primary concern is, the system or what you're doing or what you're passing on, I'm not saying it's not going to have an impact. There are people who really benefit from that kind of training, but it's a different kind of impact than if your primary thing you're there for is your students. That will show up in your training, and there is research to back that up. And so these are some of the ways. Obviously, there's more stuff, but I don't know if there's anything specific that you're interested in, but these are some of the ways that it's helped. No,
just generally, obviously, I don't have a master's degree in counseling studies, so I am not that up to speed as to everything that entails. So is there something specific that you could, for instance, share that would be like a quick tip or something or a concept that you can give people who are listening to the podcast and who are teachers or instructors, or something that you can say like, okay, look into this book or look into this topic online. There are a lot of articles about it, but that's going to help you. I know, imagine that I am a 3-year-old who doesn't know the first thing about those studies. So I'm always looking for practical advice. I know I'm putting you a little bit on the spot here, but feel free to think about it.
No, that's okay. So if I had to write an article, I would have to think about it, but I think I can give 1 or 2 pieces of info off the top of my head. So don't underestimate the importance of the psychological factors for the students. That's both in training, how is your training space comfortable, and how comfortable? Is it both comfortable and challenging? Because that's something that really makes a difference to learning. Yeah. And what does that look like? How do your students feel about the training? Because that's going to matter how it gets into their heads and what they remember. That's going to affect that. That's one thing, because again, the research shows these factors will matter in the actual situation. One thing I'm really big on is soft skills. Soft skills training, I think, is really important. And people focus on that being education a lot. People forget that, what maybe my biggest takeaway actually from other things as well, but also from the counseling, psychological skills are skills. Yep. You need to be trained like other skills. You need to make space for them. And more than that, when I started incorporating self-defense into training, a lot of it was education, right? It was telling people about, making a little space in each class. This is a thing that happens in violence. This is how you set boundaries. And then it started getting more into, okay, this is good, but this is not enough. Let's make it a little bit better. Let's have some drills. Let's have practice. So that's something that you really want to do. And then it's also really important that you actually model some of these behaviors. Or if you can't, that you're honest about it. So if you're teaching people to set boundaries, but you personally struggle to, say no to the guy who's asking for free samples or the salesman who shows up to your door, that's fine. But maybe that's something to work on. And maybe that's something to be honest with your students about.
Yeah.
Because how you show up and what you demonstrate and what you model, what the atmosphere in your dojo is like, you can't. It's hard to teach people for Aikido. I'm picking on Aikido because it's my own martial art, so I feel like I'm allowed to pick on that, right? You get some teachers who are borderline sadistic. You cannot teach people to be compassionate if you're that. You don't. Some are still going to come away with that, but it's not teaching. It's despite what you're doing. You want to model these things as much as possible and encourage that the atmosphere in your dojo reinforces positive psychology and the things that will actually help your students. So is that good? Is that kind of what you?
Yep. No, that's great. That's great. It's just that whenever somebody who is specialized in something or has, like, in your case, like a master's degree in something specific, I always try to find ways if there's something like practical that somebody can take away, knowing full well that if you have to study and work hard for several years to get that degree, that we cannot just put that in a sound bite. But very often I found that if you can just like with what you just said, that might be enough for somebody who's listening to this to think about it and then make some changes in the way he teaches and in his dojo that has a positive effect on maybe dozens of people. And I think that would be a win. And it could be that somebody in 5 years' time listens to this episode and discovers that. So kind of paying it forward in a way.
There's one more thing that I would like to add as a specific tip. Now, you just brought it to mind, which is that if you have someone who has some mental health issues in your dojo, one thing that people forget you can do is ask them how they want to handle it if something comes up.
Yeah.
They have done this longer than you, especially if you don't have any background in psychology. They might know how best to handle it, or you might give them several options.
Yeah.
And it's always important to remember that you're not their primary caretaker. If someone's issues are something that is outside the scope of what you can handle, if it endangers people, that's something that you should say.
Yeah.
But if you have someone in the dojo, if it's a thing that it's not a problem for the dojo as a whole, it's a good idea if an issue comes up to ask them.
Yeah.
How do you want to handle this? Or these are some options how you can handle this.
Yeah.
Can I help you? Rather than again, it comes back to scope of practice. You don't always have to come in as an authority figure. Chances are they've lived with it longer than you.
No, makes good sense. Makes good sense. All right. I've pretty much run out of the questions for this part. So this is the first part. Dan and I are going to keep on recording for the bonus episode over on my Patreon. Anything you want to add, Dan?
No, I think that's I had nothing I can think of. Thanks for having me. This has been really fascinating.
Oh, it was a lot of fun for me too. So, and again, we're going to keep recording, but where can people reach you? I've got your website that is harmandharmony.com, right?
Yes. So the website's the best place. I'm in the process of setting up a Patreon that's had a couple of delays because of other live stuff, but the links will be also in the website. So that is the best place for everything.
Okay, excellent. And then I'll also put a link to the blog post about the research that you looked at so that people can find that immediately on your website as well. So that's going to be the easiest way, I think. All right. Well, folks, that's it. Like I said, all the links will be at wimsblog.com/63, number 63. Dan and I will be recording some more because I got a bunch of questions from my patrons. And I'll put a link to that bonus episode also on the main show notes page. All right, that's it, guys. Everybody, see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.